Okay. Thanks for your time this afternoon.
Pleasure.
I've got a few questions to quiz you on.
Okay.
We'll start from the beginning. You, I imagine, always wanted to be a soldier.
Yeah. If I'm thinking back to my early school years, I decided quite early on, in fact, at the tender age of 13, that I intended to join the army. So that was quite, I would say, quite young, and perhaps one could say naive at that point in time, because did I really know what I was letting myself in for? I thought it did then, but at 13, with hindsight, probably not. But there was a very clear objective. I wanted to get into the army, and I wanted to attain a commission.
And knowing that you wanted to go into the army, did you feel strongly that you wanted to go to war as well?
I don't think that really came into it at that point in time. It's quite self-evident when you're thinking about joining the forces that you may well have to go to war, but it isn't the overriding factor. At that time, it's more the outdoor life, activity, comradeship, fun, travel, excitement, responsibility.
Leaving home and getting out and being with the boys?
No problem at all with that thought process, and very clear in my mind that I was going to leave home early. I needed to get out. I found it quite suffocating. So maybe the fact that my father was a Battle of Britain fighter pilot, there was a driving force there.
Did you feel pressure?
Yeah, to be honest, at that point I probably did. And more so with hindsight, now knowing what I know, one could say I was living out my father's missed dream, because he left the Air Force at the end of the Second World War, much against his better judgment. My mother wanted him out, and he came out, but he never really left in his own mind. He stayed in and lived his days out till he was 84, always thinking about the forces. So he was 100% behind my decision to join the forces, and gave me every support he could.
Okay. So training-wise, you went in as a boy. Looking back in hindsight, do you agree with all the training you had at the time? Do you feel you were prepared enough for things that we're about to face?
I would say that the unit I joined, which was the Infantry Junior Leaders Battalion at Oswestry in Shropshire, was the finest training establishment within the UK to prepare you for a future career in the army. Now, whether that be in peacekeeping or at war, it did both. Primarily it focused on peacekeeping, because again, the war aspect didn't really come front of mind. But what can I say about that experience? I turned up at the barracks age 16 and entered a 2-year training regime where you were basically dehumanised. You felt at 16 you probably went in calling hot shots, but by 16 years and 1 day into the training, you started to become dehumanised and drilled both practically and in mind, and deconstructed really as a character, and then built up into a fighting machine, and one could say de facto a killing machine.
Okay, it's interesting you say. So we're working forward. You reached captain status.
Yeah.
In the Welsh Guards.
Yeah. That particular aspect is interesting from the point of view that when I joined the Infantry Junior Leaders Battalion, that primarily, the aim of the battalion was to train you to become a non-commissioned officer or a warrant officer, future non-commissioned officers, future warrant officers of the British Army, not officers. But I went in with the specific aim of being an officer. So from that point of view, from day one, I was unique, because nobody had gone for a commission in this way before. And that was primarily because of my mediocre O-level results. You had to have 5 O-levels to become an officer. I went into Oswestry age 16 with 3, I took 2 more, so I achieved the minimum of 5, which would allow me to try for a commission.
Okay. So let's skip forward a few years.
Yeah.
You've now qualified.
Yeah.
What do you remember of the falling out parade for your what do you call it?
Passing out parade.
Yeah. So what do you remember of your passing out parade?
Oh, primarily pride, absolute pride. That there I'd been for 2 years, and I had been, I think, successfully deconstructed, dehumanised, but built up into a fairly, I would say, well-rounded character, supremely fit, and understanding the requirements that I was going to face in the immediate few years. Again, not great thoughts about going to war at that point in time, but certainly within those 2 years and on passing out day, proud and, I would say, fit to fight.
So you've mentioned already that you would say a killing machine to an extreme.
Yeah.
Would that be in a mental sense or a physical sense?
Both. Because one doesn't work without the other. Physically, you've got to be fit, and mentally, you've got to be prepared and focused to accept that ultimate challenge. And conversely, you've also got to think about the fact that you may well have to lay your life down as well. I mean, the bit we perhaps haven't mentioned, but worth saying, that when you join the army, you do sign up, and you're signing up for Queen and Country, and it's quite clear that you could ultimately pay the sacrifice of losing your life. I don't think many people, when they sign that piece of paper, think they are going to lay their life down, because we all think we're going to walk on water, don't we, forever. But it is a tacit reminder that at the end of the day, you could be losing your life. So it's something tucked away in the memory bank.
So from a personal point of view, there's lots of adverts about recruiting new people into the army. There's lots of flashing lights, there's lots of outdoor activities, there's moving away from home. There's a lot of positive for joining the army. Do you agree with the way that they are going about their advertising?
Yeah.
Or is there an underlining point that you could lose your life and you could kill?
No, I think primarily the adverts that I was subjected to, and I would say still the advertising for a career in the forces, are aimed at join the army, join the forces, have a great outdoor life, have a good social life, have a good family life. But more recently, then clearly they're bringing in more operational shots, and with the most recent wars of Iraq and Afghanistan, they are well portrayed, because without that it would be mis-selling. So if you join the army now, you would know 100% you would have to put your life on the line, and you would have to face up to the fact you're going to kill. So perhaps there is a change has been effected to attract recruits.
Okay. So if we talk about some of your experiences at war, what happened from the passing out parade? What was the first hands-on mission that you remember?
Quite soon after being commissioned and serving in Windsor in the Welsh Guards and doing all the ceremonial duties, I went out to Germany and adopted a mechanised role, command of the platoon, and within a few months I found myself on the streets of Northern Ireland, and that was a war which some would say perhaps it wasn't a war, particularly in the early 70s, because it was so on the doorstep of the UK, and there wasn't an obvious enemy vis-a-vis the Second World War or the First World War, where one was fighting primarily the Germans. In Northern Ireland, you were up against your own kith and kin, apart from the fact they were Irish. So there was an underlying current of not knowing your enemy, and that was probably the most overriding factor of my time out in Northern Ireland, as who actually was the enemy. Not every Irish person, but that was, I think, was singularly the most different aspect from fighting a war where somebody's talking a different language, they're foreigners, and you're actually invading a foreign country. This was part of the United Kingdom, which is a very different type of war.
And it's still a war that is going on and will go on for a long time.
Well, it has gone down as the longest war that the British Army has ever been involved with. At the time, it was 30 years plus from start to actually cessation of hostilities. But as we sit here today in 2010, there actually has been a resurgence, albeit still fairly small. But there are extreme factions, both within the IRA and the Protestant community, who have got a vested interest in keeping hostilities going, sadly. I think it's a generational game. If their fathers, mothers, siblings were injured or killed, they probably would still have a grudge to bear against the, as they saw it, army of occupation, which were the British forces.
And at the time, were you pro this war?
Personally, I think my initial reaction was it was a very sad war, in as much as historically we really did create the situation in Northern Ireland that erupted in the early 70s in civil unrest because we were involved in the Easter Rising in Southern Ireland much earlier on, and one could say we bred that war, and I would put my hand up to say that perhaps we were culpable in starting it. Not everybody would have the same view of that, but I feel quite strongly that we did actually contribute to the hostilities that took place, and those hostilities were extreme by any standards.
So how do you continue to fight knowing you're not for it 100%?
Plainly back to the covenant I signed that I would serve my Queen and country and acquit the role that I was commissioned to do, which was to go where I was told to go and do what I was told to do in the context of freedom of thought as well. But at the end of the day, I had to fulfil that covenant, and I didn't have a problem with that. It was a just requirement to go and do it. And in the context of Northern Ireland, I can recall an experience of sitting down with a Protestant and a Catholic member of the community and debating the rights and wrongs of the war. Was it just? And deciding myself there was nothing to choose between the two of them. The Catholic community, I think, being the minority, had a very just reason to kick up a fuss and ultimately take up arms because they were downtrodden by the Protestants, who were 2/3 majority. They got all the jobs in Northern Ireland, and they suppressed the Catholics. They weren't allowed to have jobs, and they lived in very shabby, squalid conditions throughout Northern Ireland. And the recipe for war was always going to be there. And the difficulty with that was, going back to the previous comment, was knowing one's enemy, because you didn't know. You could be standing talking, as we're sitting here this evening talking, and you may well be the enemy that I didn't know I was facing. So that was very difficult, and I think that's a major difference between other war theatres. Bring up to speed now, Afghanistan, Iraq, quite clearly you know the enemy in the context of a foreigner. They might melt into a civilian population one day and then come out as an insurgent and actually take up arms and fight. But in Northern Ireland, it was very, very difficult to really get a handle on who the hell you were fighting. A confusing war, and one could say war is an utter state of confusion, because at the end of the day, that's what it is. When the bullets and the bombs start going off, it is pure confusion, and you're trying out of this, let's call it a scene of hell, trying to make some sense out of it, and it's quite difficult. But the training, going back to being a junior soldier, that you talked about earlier and asked me about, certainly prepared me for that, and I could draw on the strength. So I felt equipped from an early age to deal with those hostilities that I then found myself in.